question if there is a need and necessity for it and it's something you can do. I think that's a pivotal time mark right there.
Right. One other point concerning the paramedics, Joey, is Derek Smith is noting he's alone working on this cardiac arrest patient, George Floyd. All alone. And to Darren's point, he's the one that has to remove the handcuffs as well, as you're trying to save a life.
Powerful and damning testimony, which begs the question as to whether Chauvin will take the stand and try to explain himself. And in assessing and talking about that, it's important to know, because people say, well, he should testify, he should explain himself. The reverse of that is he'll be savaged. And when I say that, there's something called cross-examination, to where you ask the question. So the paramedics arrived. They expressed concern. When they got on the scene, they noted no motion from Mr. Floyd. Didn't you? You were right on top of him. Did you not reassess what you were doing? Did you not take heed and hold that he's in your care and therefore he should be cared for? Did you not know what they knew, right? That he should be removed immediately? Couldn't you have removed him sooner? So many questions he'd have to ask. And what about your tone, sir? There came a time that you spoke to a supervisor about this later, and you didn't mention anything about the neck, did you? Didn't mention the length of time you held his neck? Didn't mention anything about your knee being on his neck? Is that omission because you knew it was wrong? There's just so many things when you think about, hey, we want explanations for this. It doesn't make sense. Chauvin, give us the explanations. As a defense attorney, you have to evaluate whether giving those explanations will do more harm than good.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be heading into court any moment now. Day 5 of testimony in the Derek Chauvin trial coming up. Stay with us.
What's my safe flight story? Mike?
We're kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, but this idea of opioid use and tolerance and what was in his system and what was identifiable, we know about a previous overdose. The question is going to be about what the toxicology reports say, what a man of his size would be able to conceivably metabolize in terms of drugs in his system, and how you're going to prove the case that, remember, it's not the sole cause of death, but it would have been a substantial causal factor in the death of George Floyd. They're going to move us on that journey towards that direction now to prove that very important element of the case.
Right, and then the defense will try to move them back from that journey, I imagine.
Right.
Charles Ramsey, during cross-examination with the paramedics, the defense, it asked about drug use a lot, right? And that gets to the question that Laura Coates is describing as coming up next. He asked this one, whether overdose patients can regain consciousness and then be aggressive. This is the defense speaking here. The paramedic answered to the defense, yes, that can happen. Significance of that as you heard that.
Well, I know what he's trying to get at. You know, when Narcan, for an example, is administered for someone who has an opiate overdose, it's not uncommon for them because it takes them out of their high to be a little aggressive. This is a whole different situation. And even if he had come to, you still got 4 police officers, you got a man in prone position, he's handcuffed. Even if he did come to, you still have control. You are in a controlling position. So, I mean, to me, the argument there is very weak, and one has nothing to do with the other.
Laura Coates, we don't know exactly how long the trial will go. Folks talking about 4 weeks here. Give folks who are watching now a sense of what happens next when the defense as well will have a chance to more aggressively present their own case.
So you lead with your trump. You're going to have the very emotionally compelling witnesses that are going to testify first, who are really going to give you the color to this story of black and white. Then you're going to go towards what are going to be, to the crowd, the court of public opinion, far less exciting testimony, much more scientifically oriented, much more detailed, nuanced about what needs to be proven. You're going to see a lot more evidence that they're trying to get in, like the reports, like the autopsy, like actual hard data they're going to refer to. It's going to be the part in the trial over the next several days to a week where you're really going to have to get that evidence in. And the expert testimony is going to be about their credentials, about what you do in the autopsies, how you decide toxicology reports, what the impact would be. It's going to be a lot of the data around it, not so much of the emotional, provocative testimony, because now, if they're moving in that direction, Jim, you're talking about entirely disinterested parties. not bystanders, not people who watched what happened, not people who have personally known George Floyd, but you're talking about people who are far removed and are looking at the raw data and making decisions. Now,
Okay.
that's going to be a little bit of a battle in that respect as well, though.
Okay, we'll watch closely.
Eight Ahead is now dropping the Mister like a hot potato.
The Moose for Dr. Seuss.
Did you know?
Let's listen in.
Having witnesses remove their masks, if you're comfortable with that, we prefer that so we can hear you a little better.
Absolutely.
And if you could pull up a little bit to the microphone.
Right.
And start by stating your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is John Curtis Edwards, JON-CURTIS-EDWARDS.
Mr. Sushik.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Would you please tell the jury your occupation?
Minneapolis Police Sergeant,
How long have you held that position?
2007, so approximately 14 years.
Not as a sergeant, but as a police officer for 14 years?
Yes, sir.
All right. So you started as a police officer in 2007. Did you start with the Minneapolis Police Department?
I started as a cadet in the cadet program.
All right. But that was your first job in law enforcement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You started as a cadet. Describe that experience, if you would.
The cadet program is a curriculum designed for those who have graduated college from accredited college to undergo more criminal justice and law classes, as well as partake in skills, as well as various scenario-based simulations pertaining to law enforcement. It's a curriculum designed with the end goal of becoming post-certified by the Post Board.
And the post is the Police Officer Standards and Training Board, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And that's how you get your license to be a police officer in the state of Minnesota, correct?
Correct. After obtaining that, you can be a officer, a licensed peace officer in the state of Minnesota.
And you occasionally take...
Oh, yes. Not a problem. All right. Thank you.
All right. You occasionally take continuing education credits to keep your license current?
Correct.
You do that as part of in-service training, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So after you graduated from the academy and became post-certified, what was your job duties?
Upon graduating the academy, you are a new officer on FTO.
What do you mean by FTO?
Every new officer is assigned a FTO, which is a field training officer, and that is usually a veteran officer who you, for about 4 to 5 months, you're on rotation with a new or with a veteran officer as you learn the ropes.
After you completed your field training, then did you become a patrol officer?
Yes, sir.
And can you please share with the jury the different places within Minneapolis that you were assigned as a patrol officer?
From there, I went and was assigned to the 5th Precinct, and that is also South Minneapolis, located off of 31st and Nickel, where I was a patrol 911 responder. And I primarily worked the night shifts. I worked middle watch shift and our dog watch shift. Our dog watch shift just pretty much means overnights. We started at the nighttime and the shift ends when the sun comes up. So my journey started on the night shifts in the 5th Precinct.
Now, through the course of your MPD career, you've been assigned to different units or teams, is that right?
Yes, sir.
One of those was a community response team, is that right?
Yes. I did approximately maybe a year and a half in our CERT team, community response team. That is a unit that's not bound by 911 patrol. That is a unit that's primarily focused on crime patterns that are happening within that precinct. So we did a lot of burglary suppression, robbery suppression, prostitution, things of that nature that were highly focused on specific crimes in that precinct.
You've also been assigned to the community engagement unit, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And could you describe what that unit is?
Let me take some water for this. So I was in the community engagement unit for approximately 2 years. Now that unit was a unit that derived from former President Obama's 21st Century Policing Initiative, which pretty much means more community-oriented policing. And that unit that I was a part of was primarily focused on the specific needs of the community. So I worked directly with members of the community, things of like neighborhood watch organizations, a lot of meetings, but it was specific to specific needs of the community. And we weren't 911 patrol.
And after you finished that assignment, you mentioned that your current rank is that of sergeant, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
On leave right now.
And you had to take a test to be a sergeant and then get selected, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so now you're a patrol sergeant. Where are you currently assigned?
I'm on leave right now.
Prior to that, immediately prior to starting your leave, which
I was assigned to the 3rd Precinct Dog Watch shift, the overnight shift.
Now, when you're working as a shift sergeant, do you typically wear a uniform?
Yes, sir.
Outfitted with a body-worn camera?
Yes, sir.
Do you have a partner?
No. I'm one of 3 sergeants that are on that shift, though, but no partner.
Are you assigned a car?
Yes, sir.
When you ride, then you ride solo?
Yes, sir.
Now, you've, as a Minneapolis police officer, you've signed a certification that you're familiar with various Minneapolis Police Department policies, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Bill, it's a reparations bill. It calls for tearing down a highway because the highway's racist.
Officer, you've signed a certification that you're familiar with various Minneapolis Police Department policies, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And as part of that, in addition to all of the policies that have been introduced, we're just going to focus on that of critical incident response, all right? Now, when we, looking back to May 2020, you were supervising the dog watch shift. Were you working on May 25, 2020?
Yes, sir, I was.
And when do you recall beginning your shift?
Like I said, on the dog watch shift, our shift started at 20-30 hours, which is 8:30 p.m.
What's the first thing you do when you start the shift?
First thing I do is conduct roll call with my officers.
Describe what the roll call involves.
Roll call is basically attendance, making sure all the officers are there, everybody's there, accounted for, they're ready to work. It's a time where we pass along pertinent information about what has gone on during the day, or maybe what crime patterns and things to be aware of. And if the officers have anything that needs to be brought to the table, they can as well. Roll call concludes with me giving the officers their squad assignments and then sending them on their way so that they can start answering 911 calls.
And do you typically receive information from the previous shifts that you can pass it along to the officers you're sending out in your shift?
Sometimes. Sometimes, yeah.
You're generally familiar with the officers that you personally supervise?
Yes.
And other officers within the 3rd precinct? Are you familiar with other officers in the 3rd precinct who are not necessarily on your specific shift?
Oh, yes, yes.
Are you familiar with an individual named Derek Chauvin?
Not personally, but I do know who he is.
Do you believe you'd recognize him if you saw him?
Absolutely.
Do you see him in the courtroom today?
Yes.
Would you please point to him and... Thank you. Your Honor, may the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant?
And Floyd.
How do you know him?
Like I said, I don't know him personally. We worked out of the same building, but we worked different shifts. I wasn't his direct supervisor.
Sort of a name and face recognition.
Absolutely.
Ever socialized outside of work?
No.
Are you familiar with an officer named Tu Tao?
Yes, I know who he is.
Is it the same, basically the same type of relationship as the defendant?
Yes, we worked out of the same building, but we were on different shifts.
And Thomas Lane?
Yes.
How would you describe your relationship with Thomas Lane?
He was also on the mid-watch shift, but Thomas Lane did do a rotation when they were new on my shift, and I believe he was on my shift for about a month when he was, I think it was probably his second month on the job.
Have you ever interacted with him outside of a work setting?
No, sir.
And Alexander King?
Him as well. Same relation. He and Officer Lane were both on my shift for approximately a month, and I believe that was also his second month of being on the job.
So I'd like
to... While they're on their FTO rotation, they rotate between different shifts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to then bring you back to that roll call on the date of the question. Did you receive a telephone call around roll call time?
I believe the phone call was shortly, just as roll call concluded, yes.
And who was that phone call from?
I received a phone call from Sergeant Kluger, who was the mid-watch sergeant.
Do you recall what Sergeant Kluger, let me back up. Did Sergeant Kluger give you information that you relied upon to take further steps in your duties that night?
Yes.
Okay. What did Sergeant Kluger tell you?
Sergeant Kluger informed me that he was at the hospital at that time, and he was with a male that he described may or may not live. Later on in the night, I found out that that male was Mr. Floyd. He said he was down there at the hospital. He asked me if I would be willing to respond to the incident location of 38th in Chicago because he was tied up at the hospital at the time. He asked me if I would respond down there just to make sure, just in case we had to secure that area and make contact with any of his officers that were there on the scene still. Usually an officer-involved incident where either the officer or somebody else has died or the officer or somebody else has suffered great bodily harm that later led to death.
And based on your knowledge of Minneapolis Police Department policy, what is supposed to happen if there is a critical incident with the crime scene and with the participants?
The crime scene is supposed to be secured, which means locked down, and that is for the purpose to preserve any evidence that is there. The involved parties or the involved officers usually are chilling and awaiting escort sergeants so that they can be escorted to an interview room downtown. Appropriate notifications are made. IA, homicide, if you will, the upper administration. The area is canvassed, which just means there's a designated amount of officers that are searching the area looking for any witnesses that can give a synopsis of what they saw. And then we wait for the investigators to get there, car 21, and pretty much wait for further information from some of the superiors.
Do you take any steps with respect to body-worn cameras and ensuring that those are activated?
Absolutely.
What do you do?
To make sure that ensure that everybody's body-worn cameras are active and running at all times.
And in this specific case, did you take steps consistent with the procedures you just outlined?
Yes, when I arrived on scene, yes.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 1. After you got off the phone with Sergeant Kluger, did you go directly to 38th in Chicago?
I told Sergeant Kluger that I didn't mind going down there. I just had to gather some of my things and then I'd head down there. So I believe I got down there to 38th in Chicago at about 9:35 p.m. was when I arrived there.
Were you wearing your body-worn camera?
Yes.
And it was activated?
Yes.
Can you please describe the scene as you recall it when you arrived?
It's 38th in Chicago, so it's kind of a high-profile area. 38th Street and Chicago Avenue are both major thoroughfares in South Minneapolis. And when I arrived, the only people that were there were Officers King and Lane, it seemed. There wasn't very many other people around when I arrived there.
Now, you indicated that your body-worn camera was activated, and prior to testifying today, you've had an opportunity to review various still photographs taken from the footage of your body-worn camera. Is that right?
Yes.
And at this time, Your Honor, I'm going to offer Exhibits 81 through 95, which are images taken from Sergeant Edwards' body-worn camera. And you indicated that Officers King and Lane were at the scene when you arrived.
I did.
Publish Exhibit 81. Do you recognize the individuals in this photograph, Exhibit 81?
I do.
And who is this individual?
It's Officer Lane.
And this?
It's Officer King.
Can you tell the jury what any interaction you had with Officers Lane and King when you arrived?
When I arrived there, I was met by Officer King first. First thing I did was I told him, hey, if your body-worn camera is not on, turn it on now. He did. Officer Lane came out of the car several seconds afterwards, told the same thing to him, and he activated his body-worn camera.
Right, so Lane was initially sitting in the car?
Yes, sir.
Do you know what car?
His squad car, the one that's pictured right there.
Is that 320?
Sure.
Is that a squad car assigned to that sector within the 3rd Precinct?
Yeah, that's a Middle Watch squad.
After you instructed both officers to activate or make sure their body-worn camera was activated, did you tell them anything else they needed to do?
Yes, I asked them where they had interaction with Mr. Floyd. They told me that they interacted with him on the sidewalk there by their squad car. They also told me they interacted with him on Chicago Avenue, right in front of the Cup Foods store.
And based on those statements, then, did you direct them to place crime scene tape around the area to preserve the scene?
Yes, so with that information I was able to gather where the incident occurred, and then I instructed them to place crime scene tape around the area so that we could preserve any potential evidence that was there.
First, I'm going to ask to publish Exhibit 82. All right, what do you see in this photograph?
That appears to be Officer King putting up crime scene tape.
And publish Exhibit 1. Do you have one of these up there, little stylus?
Yeah.
If you could use that to just roughly outline the area that will show where the crime scene tape was put up generally.
Okay, so generally, their squad was right here at the time. This is different. Their squad was here. Mr. Floyd's vehicle was right here. I had them encompass this whole area. So crime scene tape was around that whole intersection. It encompassed the entire intersection.
At the time you were having them do this, were there any other officers in the area at the time, or was it just King and Lane?
At that time, I believe it was myself, King and Lane, but I had other officers from my shift responding to the area because I knew we were gonna probably have to lock down that area.
So you asked the other officers to
Yes.
arrive? That wasn't something that was arranged before?
No,
And the purpose?
I asked for additional officers.
Let's try and talk over each other.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right. And that was for the specific purpose of keeping the area secure?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you would clear that, Your Honor. And at some point, did you learn that this in fact was a critical incident?
Later on in the night, yes.
But you were taking steps to secure the scene as if it were going to be a critical incident before that?
Yes, sir.
Forward. Mother.
Incident?
Later on in the night, yes.
But you were taking steps to secure the scene as if it were going to be a critical incident before that?
Yes, sir.
So at this point, did you really know anything about what had happened that caused you to be called out there specifically?
No, I didn't know specifics. No, at that point, I had very little specifics.
For example?
I was waiting for more phone calls from Sergeant Kluger for more direction of what was going on.
For example, you didn't know the defendant was involved at that point, is that right?
Correct.
You had a brief interaction and conversation with King and Lane, is that right?
Yes.
Based then on what they told you, you took some additional steps. Were you able to then communicate with the other officers that you directed to come to the scene to provide them direction?
Yes.
What did you ask the other officers to do?
A number of the officers I asked to canvass the area. As I explained before, that just means pretty much go door to door, see if there's any potential witnesses that may have been there when the incident occurred, and obtain a synopsis of what they saw, and to get their name and information. It's just searching for any potential witnesses and getting their story.
If we could publish Exhibit 83, another image from your body-worn camera, you see some of the other officers from your shift who you called to help you with the scene.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you to just identify some of the folks in the picture. We'll start, of course, here. Who's that?
It's Officer Lane.
Right. And this individual?
Officer Nerling.
Okay. And this person?
It's Officer Cape.
This person?
Officer Oaks.
And this person?
And Officer Areola.
And Officer Areola was a fairly new officer at the time?
Yes, sir.
Now, would you please tell the jury just sort of the scope of the security you provided to this scene at that time during these it was the early morning hours now of May 26th, is that right?
Yes, sir.
What did you do?
Shortly thereafter here, I received a call from Kluger telling me that escort officers or escort sergeants would be coming down, and that he was still downtown or at the hospital. I had been notified, and appropriate people in administration had been notified, and he just requested that the scene just remained secure. So in answer to your question, we, my guys and I just remained there for scene security to ensure that no vehicle or pedestrian traffic entered the crime scene and contaminated our scene.
You made sure no one came in to that roped off area.
Yes.
Did you take any steps with respect to the business cup foods?
Yes.
What did you do?
Sergeant Kluger asked me if I was able to make contact with the manager, and if so, speak with him, which I did.
How many officers at any given time were used to secure the scene?
I believe that night I only had about maybe 8 to 10 officers on. And I didn't have every single one of my officers on this scene. So there were still a lot of 911 calls that needed to be attended to.
In addition to securing the perimeter of the scene, did you secure any vehicles within the scene?
Yes, sir.
And what vehicles did you secure?
Officers King and Lane squad, as well as Mr. Floyd's vehicle that was parked ahead of theirs.
And could you describe that vehicle, please?
I honestly don't remember what kind of vehicle Mr. Floyd was driving.
Okay.
It was a dark colored vehicle, though, if I remember correctly.
Did you keep officers King and Lane out of the squad 320?
Yes, I did. And I told them to leave their belongings inside the squad car.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 84. So Exhibit 84, then, for the record, is a photo from your body-worn camera taken at 21:50 and 17 seconds. Is that right?
Yes.
And we see both King and Lane in the photo, correct?
Yes.
All right. And is this where you had the initial interaction with them, where you asked them to get out of the vehicle so you could secure it?
That is.
And they complied with it?
They did.
Did you see anyone, including them, take anything out of the vehicle?
No.
Was the vehicle running, or had it been stopped?
It was running.
What did you do since it was running?
I told them to get out of the car. They got out of the car.
And did you, at any point, stop the vehicle from running?
That wasn't until the BCA showed up, and I believe it was Special Agent Mike Phil told me that they were going to take custody of the squad and Mr. Floyd's vehicle. We noticed the squad car, I'm sorry, was still running, so he instructed me to power it down.
You'd also mentioned something about a canvass. Did you at some point instruct officers to do a canvass of the area for possible witnesses?
Yes, I explained that, yes.
Exhibit 84.
Area at the time that the incident occurred. We knew that the incident occurred before we got to work, so I guess we were just trying to get lucky. Maybe there was somebody still there that was willing to talk to us, or yeah.
Who did you send out to do the canvass? Was it
several officers.
Did that include Areola and Nerling?
Yes, it did.
They locate any witnesses who are willing to speak with you?
What was that?
Did they locate any witnesses who are willing to speak with you?
Who were willing to speak with me?
Yes.
No.
Did you at any point interact with an elderly or an older gentleman, I'll say elderly, older gentleman at the scene?
Yes.
Did he identify himself to you, first or last name?
He identified himself to me as Charles. He refused to give me his name, his full name.
Published Exhibit 87. It's another body-worn camera image, not from your body-worn camera, but it shows, who is this?
That's me.
And is this Charles?
Yes, sir.
And this point captures the conversation that you had with him at 22:05 in about 43 seconds. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
He did not provide any information to you.
No, he did not. I explained to him that he'd be very valuable to us if he had something to say or if he saw something, but he told me he refused to say anything and wondered if he was under arrest, and I told him no, and he told me he wanted to leave.
And of course, you didn't know whether or not he had spoken with anybody already about this incident.
Correct. That was the first time I seen him.
Did you ask King and Lane to participate in the canvass?
No, I don't believe I did. No.
What did you ask them to do?
I asked them to chill out because later on I knew from Sergeant Kluger that he had a couple of escort sergeants coming down to transport them to interview room 100.
Publish Exhibit 85. All right, looking at Exhibit 85 from your body-worn camera at 21:51:25, you see officers Lane and King. Were they standing where you told them to stand, waiting where you told them to wait?
Correct.
And at this time, you instructed them to keep their body-worn cameras activated, is that right?
Correct.
Do you recall speaking with any other potential witnesses while you were at the scene?
No, I don't.
Do you recall entering Cup Foods?
Yes. Yes.
Speak with anybody at Cup Foods?
Yes. Like I said before, Sergeant Kluger asked me to see if I could make contact with the manager there at Cup Foods, and I did, and I spoke with him.
Publish Exhibit 86. All right, this is an image from your body-worn camera at 21:54:32. Who is that individual?
I do not remember his name, but he is the manager there at Cup Foods.
And did you learn whether or not he was a witness to the interaction between the police and George Floyd?
He said he didn't witness anything. I had a brief conversation with him.
When you arrived, you testified that you'd taken control of the scene, right? As the sergeant, you were the ranking officer there.
Yes, sir.
At some point, did another ranking officer arrive at the scene?
Yes. As well as Sergeant Dale.
You know what, that's a little hard to see, but can you identify the people in this photo?
That's myself, and that's Lieutenant Zimmerman.
When did he arrive approximately? If you could take the cutout out.
When did he arrive approximately?
Yes.
I couldn't tell you the time he arrived. I can tell you the timestamp that I'm seeing right there.
Yep.
22:06.
All right.
So that would be 10:06 p.m.
So even if not exact arrival time, this is pretty close in time to Lieutenant Zimmerman's first arrival?
Yes.
All right. When Lieutenant Zimmerman arrived, what happened with the scene?
He came and just ensured that we had the scene secure. He came and ensured that we had officers that were canvassing the area for any potential witnesses that were still there. Yeah,
Did you see Lieutenant Zimmerman interact with either the involved officers, Lane or King?
I don't recall seeing him interact with Lane or King.
Did you impart to Lieutenant Zimmerman any information that you had gathered about the scene or potential witnesses to that point?
Can you ask that question again?
Sure. Did you tell Lieutenant Zimmerman what you did up to that point to get him caught up on the scene and the witnesses and what steps had been taken?
Oh, yes.
All right. Did he direct you to take any further steps now he's a lieutenant, so I suppose?
More canvassing of the area, and also he wanted more officers there at the scene.
Did he confirm that the scene itself was secure?
Yes.
And that the squad was secure at 320?
Yes.
And that Mr. Floyd's vehicle was secured?
Yes.
So there was another officer there, a Sergeant Bob Dale. What is Bob Dale assigned to?
He was there. He came with Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Bob Dale's from homicide, is that right?
I believe so.
And then with this being a critical incident, this was going to be handed over to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, correct?
Well, at that point, we still didn't know if this was indeed a critical incident, but I was going under the assumption that it was, it's better safe to go that way than not.
And because of that, there were some steps taken to ensure that when this was handed off, it would be handed off in a manner that it could be taken over with smoothly, correct?
Yes.
So it was, did either Dale or Zimmerman make a suggestion to you about having a crime scene log?
Yes.
All right. What did they ask for?
They just asked if the crime scene log had been started, and I tasked Officer Areola with that task. Crime scene log is just a log of names of officers and personnel that entered the crime scene.
And did you see Officer Areola start compiling a crime scene log?
Yes.
Published Exhibit 89. All right, you can see this Officer Areola here.
Yes.
And he appears to be holding something, is that right?
Yes.
Is that the crime scene log?
I believe so.
So as you testified, at some point you learned that Mr. Floyd had died, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall how you received that information?
It was later on in the night, Sergeant Dale actually informed me that Mr. Floyd had passed away.
Was that pretty shortly after Dale and Zimmerman had arrived?
Yeah. Yes.
About 10:13 p.m., is that right?
It was sometime after Sergeant Dale and Lieutenant Zimmerman arrived.
Then after that point, were there arrangements made for transport officers to bring Lane and King to City Hall pursuant to critical incident protocol?
There were.
Did you watch that happen?
Yes. Officers Walitsky and Officer Ashoff responded to the scene, and they were Officer King and Officer Lane's transport sergeants.
Published Exhibit 90. There's additional body-worn camera footage. Do you see Officer or Sergeant Ashoff in this photo?
Yes.
Would you take your stylus and draw a circle? And Walitsky?
I don't see Walitsky in this photo.
Was this, so according to the timestamp, 22/18/14, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And that was around the time that the transport officers arrived, and I'm assuming the transport would have happened fairly shortly after that.
Correct.
And they transported Lane and King to, what's it, room 100 within City Hall?
Room 100.
And it was about, shortly after that, about 15 minutes or so later, that the VCA took over the scene.
Yes, I was notified by Lieutenant Zimmerman that the BCA is on their way and they'll be taking over the scene. So we were requested, me and my guys were requested to just stay put for scene security.
Do you recall when BCA arrived?
I don't remember what time they arrived, no.
Show you Exhibit 91. Do you remember the name of the agent?
Yes, I believe his name was Special Agent Michael Phil.
Can you tell the jury what you see here in Exhibit 91? Who are those people?
That appears to be Special Agent Michael Phil standing alongside Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Right here?
Yes.
And that's at 2300? Is that right?
Correct.
That's the approximate time then that the BCA took over the scene?
Approximately.
You saw Special Agent Phil have a conversation with Lieutenant Zimmerman. After that conversation took place, did you have a conversation with Lieutenant Zimmerman?
I believe I had a conversation with both of them afterwards.
Okay.
Pensions of minors, of families, most of those being released into the U.S. It's overwhelming, the Border Patrol, it's overwhelming.
I believe I had a conversation with both of them afterwards.
Okay.
Brief interaction.
When did Lieutenant Zimmerman remain at the scene after the BCA took over, or did he leave?
Well, he came up to me and just told me pretty much that it's in the BCA's hands now, and they'll be here, and just to ensure that myself and my officers remain on scene for scene security until the BCA tells us they're done with their job and that we can take down the crime scene tape and leave.
Publish Exhibit 92. And this is Special Agent Phil.
Yes, that is.
During the period of time you were speaking with him and getting instruction on what to do with the scene?
Yes.
Did he ask you to do anything with Squad 320?
Yes.
What did
he
he ask
told
you?
me that they were taking custody of both the squad and Mr. Floyd's vehicle. And we noticed that the squad was still running. He asked me to open it up and power it down, which I did.
Did you remove anything from the vehicle?
No, sir.
Now, at this point, the BCA has a scene, you're no longer taking any investigative steps or collecting evidence, is that right?
Correct.
But did you make observations of other officers doing those things, watching the BCA?
Such as?
Such as anything with the vehicle?
No. No. I didn't see anybody doing anything with the vehicles. Any other officer, if that's what you're asking.
Did you see other officers taking photographs, looking at the vehicle?
No, sir.
Did you see any forensic scientists or people you recognize to be forensic scientists come onto the scene?
Just the team of people that Special Agent Michael Phil had with him.
And those
there
were
were several BCA people there.
Those were the folks who were allowed in the scene, is that right?
Yes.
At some point, did you watch Mr. Floyd's vehicle be actually towed away by the BCA?
Yes. Ultimately, Special Agent here had both the squad car as well as Mr. Floyd's vehicle towed from the scene.
And you watched them do that?
Yes, I was still on scene then.
Publish Exhibit 94. Is this an image of the BCA towing away Squad 320?
Yes.
And they'd already towed the SUV at this point, is that right?
I believe so.
Towed away.
After the BCA had the vehicles towed away, it wasn't very long after that Special Agent Michael Phil told me that they were all finished now and we could take down the crime scene tape and leave.
Did you do so?
Yes, sir.
Published Exhibit 95. This is at 3:34 and 54 seconds. What does this image show?
That's at 3:34 a.m. and that's me. Those are my hands helping take down the crime scene tape.
And so at this point, then the crime scene was cleared, no longer needed to be secured, and you would be able to exit the area. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. Thank you very much. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
You may.
Good morning, everybody. I am Bianca Rodrigo. We are in day 5 in the trial of Derek Chauvin. We have been watching the testimony of Sergeant John Edwards, who's a Minneapolis police sergeant who came to the scene in the moments and hours following the death of George Floyd. I want to get our panel, Laura Coates, to come in and weigh in here along with Charles Ramsey to get their take on what they just heard and the impact, if any, from John Edwards' testimony. Laura, what did you take away?
Well, it might seem like a very sort of benign or a obtuse sort of thing going on right now, but what the prosecution has to do is they've got to ensure they're very meticulous about presenting evidence. What happened all the way through the end of it being a crime scene? They speak to witnesses. Were any witnesses compromised? Was there anything that was tainted on the scene in any way, shape, or form? They've got to lay it out. They don't want the defense to be able to articulate at a later time that something was awry in the investigation or development of this case, or that there was some body of evidence or something that would be important to their defense.
Chief Ramsey, this is the first time I believe we have heard from a police officer throughout this testimony this week. Anything stand out to you from what we just heard from Sergeant Edwards?
Well, there's some procedural differences that are different from anything that my experience in dealing with these kinds of things and that they...
It's Richard Zimmerman, R-I-C-H-A-R-D, and then Zimmerman, Z-I-M-M-E-R-M-A-N.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you. Can you please tell the jurors what you do for a living?
I'm a police officer with Minneapolis Police Department.
How long have you been a police officer?
Since June 3rd of 1981.
And all that with Minneapolis?
No, the first 4 years from 81 to 85, I worked for the Fillmore County Sheriff's Department in southeast Minnesota.
What did you do there?
I was a patrol deputy responding to 911 calls.
And so then it was, 1985 that you started with Minneapolis?
Yes, I had the weekend off and started in Minneapolis in June 5th of 1985.
And are you a licensed peace officer in the state of Minnesota?
Yes, I am.
When did you first obtain your license?
I'm sorry?
When did you first obtain your license?
June 3rd of 1981.
And as a police officer, having that license, are you required to do certain things to maintain that license?
Yes.
What kinds of things do you have to do?
We have to do continuing ed, like any other professional license. And we have to do 40 hours of different education, professional education. In a certain time period, I'm not sure if it's 1 or 2 years.
And if you don't, somebody's going to let you know, right?
Yes, they will.
And so, since 1981, have you done all that's been required to maintain your license?
Yes, I have.
When you started with the Minneapolis Police Department in 1985, What was your job? What were your duties?
I was a patrolman. I worked the North Side Precinct. It's called Precinct 4. And I worked the 3rd Precinct. It's called Precinct 3, of course. And then my permanent assignment was the 5th Precinct, which is like Franklin, Nicollet, Hennepin Avenue, Lake Street.
So when you're working as a patrol officer, what kind of things do you do?
Yeah, well, we respond to 911 calls. We, deter crime, or try to deter crime, I should say. Yeah, that's kind of what we do. Traffic control, that kind of thing.
Out on the streets every day?
Yes.
At least every day you work, right?
Yes.
And so then, did your job duties change eventually?
Yes, in 1990, crack became really prevalent in the late 80s, and so I joined the crack team in the 5th Precinct, where there were 4 officers and a sergeant, and we would do search warrants, looking for drugs, that kind of thing.
And so what year was that? I'm sorry.
Pardon me?
What year was that?
1990 to 1993.
And what did you do then in 1993?
I took the sergeant's exam and passed it, and was assigned to the adult sex crimes unit.
And so what does it mean to be promoted to sergeant?
Well, you take a series of tests, and once you're promoted, you express your interest as patrol or investigations. And so I talked to the lieutenant in charge of the sex crimes unit and expressed my interest.
So you mentioned having to take an exam?
Yes.
Just like sitting down and, like we do in school, taking an exam?
Yeah, it was a written exam, and once you pass that phase, then you would take an oral exam, and then you were given your scores.
And so you became a sergeant. Did some supervisory responsibilities come with that?
Yes.
Can you just describe for the jurors, like, what kinds of responsibilities a sergeant takes on?
Yeah, well, as a investigative sergeant, you're assigned a case to follow up with the victims, and you do search warrants. And when you're doing search warrants, you have officers that assist you. So you'll assign them duties that, such as, assisting with the search warrant.
Recent.
So you'll assign them duties that, such as, assisting with the search warrant.
And also have responsibilities to make sure the officers underneath you are properly trained?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And, when I would do search warrants, I would explain to the officers that we don't want anyone to get hurt, either the officers or the subjects.
And so, just continuing with your history then, you went into the sex crimes unit as a sergeant, and subsequent to that, did your responsibilities change?
Yes.
Can you tell the jurors about that?
Yeah, in 1995, the homicide unit was expanding because of the amount of murders that were occurring in Minneapolis in 1995. So they brought in myself and one other guy from the robbery unit, and we were assigned partners in the homicide unit.
And which unit do you currently work in?
1995.
Which unit do you currently work in?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, the homicide unit.
So from 1995 to today, you've been in the homicide unit?
Yes.
And did you, sometime during that period, receive another promotion?
Yes.
Tell the jurors about that, please.
Yeah, in 2007, I took a lieutenant's exam, or 2006. I took the lieutenant's exam, and that's a series of, again, written tests and oral. If you pass that phase, then you go on to the oral interview phase, and you're notified of your results.
And so you were promoted to lieutenant?
Yes, I was.
So how did that change your responsibilities, your job duties?
Well, usually when you're promoted, you're assigned to a different unit than you worked. But they asked me to stay in the homicide unit because of my experience. And so I took over the job in 2008, November of 2008. And the duties are, I get called for every death, suspicious death, deaths where, it's clearly a homicide, deaths where officers have any question about how a person may have died. I go out to the scenes.
And do you also supervise other officers?
Yes, I do.
Just describe for the jury your responsibilities in supervising other officers.
Yes, we have, right now we have 12 detectives in homicide that make up 6 teams. They work with a partner in homicide, and they're on a rotation basis for being on call. They're on call Monday through Monday, and when a team is on call, I'll go out to a scene, assess, what the death may be involved, and I'll call the on-call team to come in and start working the case.
So you still respond to scenes?
Yes. Pulling up the cases, and we pull up every death report in Minneapolis, and I'll look through each report, and I'll assign a case that I might have some questions about, and I'll talk to the detectives, explain why I think this needs to be looked into, and that's Monday through Friday kind of thing.
And so are you their direct supervisor then?
Yes.
So you started with Minneapolis Police Department in 1985?
Yes.
Do you know where you are in terms of seniority in the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes.
Where is that?
I'm the #1 officer in seniority. I hate to say that, but I am.
Understood. Were you called out to a scene on May 25th of 2020?
Yes.
And do you recall, why you were called to that scene?
Yeah, homicide responds, or I respond initially to critical incidents. And a critical incident can be anything from a death to a serious injury of either officers or the public. And so I was called in on this one.
So were you technically on duty at that time?
I was at home, and I was notified by my commander of this incident that happened at 38th in Chicago.
And so then did you respond to that scene?
Yes.
And do you recall about what time it was that you arrived at the scene?
It was a little bit after 9 p.m.
And the location of 38th in Chicago, were you familiar with that location at that time?
Yes.
Fair to say no stranger to calls of violent incidents at that intersection?
Yes, absolutely.
And when you arrived, can you just describe for the jury what you first saw when you arrived at that location?
I arrived on 38th Street, and I parked on the southwest corner on 38th Street. I saw yellow tape up, we call it, it's crime scene tape, around the intersection. I saw Sergeant Edwards, who I know from work, on his cell phone. And I saw two officers, and he was like in the middle of the scene, kind of. And then I saw two officers standing on the southwest or the southeast corner of the intersection.
And did you then approach those two officers?
Yes, Sergeant Edwards appeared to be busy on the phone, so I just walked up to the two officers.
And I'm going to show you, well, we had an opportunity before court to show you a piece of body cam footage, shows you approaching the scene, correct?
Yes.
And that appeared to be a true and accurate representation of your approach to those two officers?
Yes, it is.
And that reflects the time as well?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 96.
Any objection?
Okay.
96 is received.
Then we'll publish 96.
For top secret mathematical formula they keep stored inside a safe.
I'm going to pause here just for a moment if I could. This is the intersection of 38th and Chicago?
Yes.
And it looks like the time reflected here is 21:56.
Yes.
So for those of us who have difficulty with that kind of math even, what is the real time that we recall?
Yeah, it's 4 minutes to 10.
Okay. So it was a little closer to 10 when you arrived?
Yes.
And there is an individual, I know it's dark and it's kind of hard to see, but do you know who the individual is in the crosswalk there?
I don't know.
And all right, let's continue. Just for the record, at 21:56:53, you see across the intersection there appears to be a person walking towards us.
Yes.
And do you know who that is?
That would be me.
All right. And we'll continue, please.
How you doing, Lieutenant?
What's going on? All right, we'll take that down. So it appears that you came to the scene in street clothes, right?
Yes.
And that's the moment where you walked up and talked to the two officers?
Yes, I did.
Did you recognize those two officers?
Yes. No, I didn't.
And you appeared to be on the phone. Do you recall who you were talking to?
I don't know if it was my commander or a deputy chief. I'm not sure.
So then when you arrived there, those two officers looked like you had just asked them a question. Did they give you some information about the incident?
Yes.
And based on that information, what did you conclude about their role in the incident?
There's a thing that we call involved officers and non-involved officers. And based on what they had told me, I determined they were involved officers.
And why would it be important to distinguish between involved and non-involved officers?
Well, if you're an involved officer, you need to be brought down to room 100 at City Hall, and you need to be brought down by a supervisor in separate cars.
And that's just according to policy?
Yes.
And so after having that conversation with them, what did you do next?
I talked to the sergeant, I believe, Sergeant Edwards, and told him that we needed some more people out here. He told me another sergeant was on his way, and I told him that we needed to get these two guys downtown.
And which sergeant, you remember, I'm sorry, which sergeant that was?
I'm sorry?
Which sergeant that was you talked to?
I don't remember.
Okay. Was it Sergeant Edwards?
I believe that's who I first talked to.
And so showing you Exhibit 90, if we could please. And this is a photograph for the record of 2218. This is you speaking on the phone at that time, correct?
Yes.
And so here you're still dealing with things at the scene, is that right?
Yes.
And so, we can take that back, I guess, thanks. The sergeant that you talked to, what kinds of things did you ask that sergeant to take care of?
I asked the patrol sergeant to arrange to have the two involved officers brought down to room 100, and that we needed some more officers at the scene.
And why did you think you needed more officers at the scene?
To search for any possible witnesses or video.
And so then, after having that conversation, what did you do next?
I had called in two of the sergeants from homicide, the on-call team, to assist me.
And as you were doing that, did you undertake any other actions to try and identify things that might be helpful for the investigation?
Yes.
Like what?
If you stand in the center of the intersection and you look for, first of all, you look for video cameras that may be hanging from different buildings, or in this case, milestone cameras.
What is a milestone camera?
It's a city camera that's set up in different areas of the city, and they can be monitored to help us deter crime or to help if a crime occurs.
And being familiar with that location, did you believe there was a milestone camera at that intersection?
I knew there was, yes.
Okay. I'm going to show you Exhibit 1. You recognize what's in that photograph?
Yes.
And what is that?
That's the intersection of 38th and Chicago.
Proposed American Jobs Plan on Wednesday in Pittsburgh. It's an 8-year program that invites, and let me put it another way. I've heard from everybody all across the country about the need for infrastructure. How many times have we heard this is infrastructure week? Need for infrastructure. How many times have we heard this is infrastructure week the last 4 years? About every second week was infrastructure week, but no infrastructure was built. It's an 8-year program that invests in our roads, our bridges, broadband, airports, ports, and fixing our water systems. It's going to repair our VA hospitals across the country, compete China and the rest of the world. Independent analysis shows that if we pass this plan, the economy will create 19 million jobs. Good jobs, blue-collar jobs, jobs that pay well. That's long-term jobs for pipe fitters, healthcare workers, those who work in the steel factories and the cutting-edge labs as well. The new report out this week shows that nearly 90% of the infrastructure jobs created in the American Jobs Plan can be filled by people who don't have a college degree. 75% of those good-paying jobs don't need an associate's degree. It's a blue-collar blueprint for increasing the opportunity for people. This is an economic opportunity for those who've helped build the country and have been ignored or neglected for much too long by our government. It's a once-in-a-generation and have been ignored or neglected for much too long by our government. It's a once-in-a-generation investment in our economic future, a chance to win the future, paid for by asking big corporations, many of which do not pay any taxes at all, just to begin to pay their fair share. And it won't raise a penny tax on a family making less than $400,000 a year. No federal tax. no addition. When Congress comes back after this Easter break, I'm going to begin meeting with Democrats, Republicans about this plan. I've spoken to Republicans on the phone. I'm going to be looking forward to meeting with them. They all have their ideas about what it will take, what they like and what they don't like. That's a good thing. That's the American way. Debate is welcome. Compromise is inevitable. Changes in my plan are certain. But inaction is not an option. The American people have been promised action and infrastructure for decades. They've been promised that after our leaders would take our country and make it more competitive for decades. I've made my plan to address this long overdue need, and it's clear. Polls already show strong support for infrastructure investment from the American people, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or Independents. Congress should debate my plan, change it, and offer alternatives if they think that's what they have to do. But Congress should act. Likewise, on the virus, our program there too can be undone. In March, we are not even halfway done yet. Too many Americans are acting as if this fight is over. It is not. I've told people that if my administration did the hard work of getting shots to all Americans in the next few months, and if the American people continued to do their part, mask up, practice social distancing, we could have a more normal July 4th.
Starting that process of turning the scene over to them.
Right, yeah.
So the time here shows 2300, about 11 p.m.
Yes.
And so then, did you in fact turn this scene over to the BCA?
Yes, I did.
That shortly thereafter concluded your involvement with the scene?
Yes.
You talked earlier about the training you need to do to maintain your peace officer's license, correct?
Yes.
And as a Minneapolis police officer, where do you get that training from?
Well, we'll get it from our training unit. We'll also get it from outside sources, different schools that are being put on. Some that are specific to homicide, some that are, a one-day course, some may be a 2-week course, that kind of thing.
Does that training include instruction on the use of force?
Yes.
And how often do you get instruction on the use of force?
Once a year.
And how many officers have to go through that use of force training every year?
Every officer on the police department.
That includes the guy who's number one in seniority?
It includes me, yes, absolutely.
And when you, let me ask it this way. Are there also Minneapolis Police Department policies about the use of force?
Yes, there is.
And are you required to be familiar with those policies?
Yes, you are.
And when you do that use of force training, does it cover the policies as well?
Yes.
Do you also do some physical activity, taking people down and rolling around?
Yes, we have a mat that we use at our SOC center, and it's like a huge wrestling mat.
And are you familiar with the use of force continuum?
Yes.
Is that part of the Minneapolis Police Department use of force policy?
Yes, it is.
Can you just describe in general what that means to the jurors?
Yeah, so basically the use of force continuum is guidelines, or it's policy actually, that we have to follow. And it's when, for instance, when you arrive at a scene, no matter what the scene, the first level, the lowest level, would be just your presence at a scene in uniform. The next step up may be your verbal skills that you've learned to help diffuse a situation or learn information about whatever the situation is. The next step would be like a soft technique, escorting the person by their arm, that type of thing. The next level would be a hard technique. That's where you would use your, you maybe have to use your mace or handcuffs, that kind of thing. And finally, the top level on the continuum is deadly force.
And so those levels change, how, under what, or for what reasons might that change?
Yeah, well, if you're, say you arrive at a scene and somebody's pointing a gun at you or shooting at you, of course you go to the top level, and that's how they may change.
So it's relative to the threat.
Right, yes.
And are there different kinds of force that officers can use?
Yes.
And have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill them.
And in your training with the Minneapolis Police Department, over the years, have you received training on restraining people?
Yes.
Including the use of handcuffs?
Yes.
And when you are handcuffing somebody, when you handcuff them, what is your responsibility as an officer with regard to that person?
Well, could I give you an example?
Okay. Well, let me ask you this again. If you, as an officer, according to the training, you handcuff somebody behind the back, what's your responsibility with regard to that person from that moment on?
That person is yours. He's your responsibility. His safety is your responsibility. His well-being and is your responsibility.
Once you handcuff somebody, does that affect the amount of force that you should consider using?
Absolutely.
How so?
Once a person is cuffed, the threat level goes down all the way, to they're cuffed. How can they really hurt you,
Well, certainly there could be circumstances when a cuffed person could still be combative.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, yeah. But you getting injured is way down.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you're, you could have some guy try to kick you or something, but you can move out of the way. That person is handcuffed, and they, the threat level is just not there.
So by handcuffing somebody, you've taken away some of their ability to harm you.
Absolutely.
And if somebody who is handcuffed becomes less combative, does that change the amount of force that an officer is to use under policy?
Yes.
How so?
Well, if they become less combative, you may just have them sit down on a curb, or the idea is to calm the person down, and if they are not a threat to you at that point, you try to help them so that they're not as upset as they may have been in the beginning.
In your
civil rights legends fought for this right. And we're not just going to sit by and allow people to walk it back because
30 years of training with the Minneapolis Police Department in your experience, have you been trained on the prone position?
Yes.
And what has your training been specific to the prone position?
Well, once you secure or handcuff a person, you need to get them out of the prone position as soon as possible because it restricts their breathing.
When you handcuff somebody behind their back, well, as part of training, have you been handcuffed behind the back?
Yes.
And have you been trained on what happens to individuals when they're handcuffed behind the back?
Yes.
So when somebody is handcuffed behind their back, how does it affect them physically?
It stretches the muscles back through your chest, and it makes it more difficult to breathe.
If you put somebody in the prone position, well, is it well known, this danger of putting somebody in the prone position? How long have you had training in the dangers of the prone position as part of a Minneapolis police officer?
Since 1985.
And is it part of your training regularly to learn about keeping somebody in the prone position?
Yes.
And what has the training been with regard to the prone position?
Once a person is cuffed, you need to turn them on their side or have them sit up. You need to get them off their chest.
Why?
Because as I mentioned earlier, your muscles are pulling back when you're handcuffed. And if you're laying on your chest, that's constricting your breathing even more.
In your training as a Minneapolis police officer, are you provided with training on medical intervention?
Yes.
I assume you're not, taught to be paramedics, but you receive some level of training.
Yeah, we're first responders, I think, is what our category would be.
Does that include doing what we think of as CPR, chest compressions?
Yes.
And how often is that part of your training?
CPR, it's like every other year or so.
And as part of your training within the Minneapolis Police Department policies, is there an obligation to provide medical intervention when necessary?
Absolutely.
What is the general teaching that you get with regard to medical intervention?
Well, again, it's been that you need to provide medical care for the person that is in distress.
And would that be true even if you've called an ambulance to come to the scene?
Yeah, absolutely. The ambulance will get there in whatever amount of time, and in that time period, you need to provide medical assistance before they arrive.
Break. The attorney is going to help deal with the issue while you're operating. And Lieutenant, you may step down if you wish.
Morgan after his explosive comments about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's interview with Oprah. It'll be Morgan's very first.
Are in recess now for about 20 minutes, according to the judge. We've been watching and listening to more testimony in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis officer who is charged with the murder of George Floyd. We just heard more testimony from two members of the Minneapolis Police Department. You were listening there most immediately to Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman. Before Lieutenant Zimmerman, we were hearing from Sergeant John Edwards, both of the men talking about their experience on the force and their interactions with the other officers the night of Floyd's death. Zimmerman was also one of the officers in that department who signed an open letter condemning Chauvin's actions. We started this week with tears. We are ending this week with technicalities, it would seem. Early on, emotional bystanders. Floyd's girlfriend spoke to his humanity. And now we're hearing from the first responders who tried and failed to revive Floyd after the encounter with Chauvin. Then Chauvin's former supervisor explaining the precise moment he says Chauvin should have stopped restraining Floyd. Let's get to our panel now. Chuck Rosenberg, MSNBC contributor, former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official. Shauna Lloyd is a managing attorney of the Cochran firm in Orlando, Florida. Charles Coleman is a civil rights attorney and a former prosecutor as well. Chuck, let me start with you here. Today we heard from more members of the Minneapolis Police Department. The prosecution asked them both when they started on the force what their duties were, their interactions with other officers, and their duties on the night of Floyd's death. There was this one question that the state asked Lieutenant Zimmerman about the use of force. It caught my attention. Take a listen.
Have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier, the deadly force.
Chuck, it seemed to me that was the thesis moment with that particular witness. How important was that moment? Am I reading too much into it?
No, I think you're right, Craig. It's an important moment. We heard something like that yesterday from Sergeant Plager as well. It should be pretty obvious to the jury that if you are in the prone position, face down in the street, with your hands cuffed behind your back, and you are unconscious, and someone continues to kneel on your neck, it's not just an unreasonable amount of force, it's also, as Lieutenant Zimmerman said, a potentially deadly force. And so, because the prosecution has to prove cause of death, and because the prosecution has to prove the intent of Officer Chauvin to kill George Floyd, this type of testimony is really important. It's coming in slowly, it's occasionally choppy, but the most important thing is it's coming in, it's there, it exists, and that will enable the prosecution in its closing to point to those portions of the testimony most helpful to it and to accentuate that for the jury. It's coming in well, in my view, well enough.
Shauna, it's worth pointing out that Lieutenant Zimmerman is one of more than a dozen Minneapolis police officers who signed that letter condemning Chauvin's actions. What does that signify to you?
It signifies a lot. Right now, in this culture of having all of the incidents that we are seeing, there are good officers. Just like in any other industry, what we see are good officers who are actually coming out and standing up to say that this was not acceptable. I'm a law enforcement officer, and I believe this is unacceptable. I think that that's going to be very significant for our jury and the overarching theme of where they stand when they look at a fellow officer and his particular individual actions.
NBC's Shaquille Brewster has been following the trial closely from the very beginning. He joins me now from outside that courthouse there in Minneapolis. And Shaq, what's your takeaway from the case the prosecution is making this morning about Officer Chauvin's use of force?
Well, it's really how this prosecution's case is developing over time. We started the week with those emotional witnesses, the bystanders who were watching and pleading with them.
Code Fox News.
Who is U.S. became post-certified? What was your job?
And it's certified, and the same with the other three officers. All of them should have been CPR certified, certainly, and that would have been appropriate to use that particular technique under the circumstances once it became apparent that he was no longer breathing. If I could just add one, because I started to say something earlier, if there's time.
Yes.
There's just minor procedural things that, to me, it's not so minor, but I don't know their protocols in Minneapolis. But you had 4 officers on the scene of that incident. We never would have left them there. I mean, you separate them, you get them to either internal affairs, or I guess they got a room 100 down in City Hall or whatever. But when Sergeant Edwards got there, 2 of them were still there in the car together. I mean, you know, that to me is a process or a procedure that the department needs to look at, because that's not typically what you would do. And the other thing, and this really goes to Laura, being an attorney, I found it curious when they continued to, and the defense continued to allow the prosecution and the witness to refer to it as a crime scene. At the time, it had not been determined that a crime had been committed. Normally, we would simply call that a critical incident scene, not a crime scene. And if I were a defense attorney, I wouldn't want that word being floated around to the jury too often, because I'm there arguing that it is not a crime, that the officers did nothing wrong. So I was just kind of curious about that, Laura.
Yeah, Laura, you want to weigh in?
I do. Well, you know, the thing about if there's a conviction and there were to be an appeal, the appellate court would look to see whether an objection has been weighed in this area here. If you don't object, you can oftentimes lose the ability to bring that up later on. But here's another example of why the defense, and questioning why the defense has allowed a number of things to go on. Normally, if you have a very emotional witness, if you've got the witness testifying, they're crying, they're evoking a lot of sentiment and resonance with the jury, you do everything you can to derail the monologue. They haven't done that a number of times and allowed a lot of things to linger in the air. Now, they'll have to reflect on what the consequences of that will be, because remember, the defense case is in the future and they're never required to actually bring one. It's always the government's burden to actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt. There are some lapses in judgment you're obviously seeing here, but I have to note what Charles is talking about. You know, these other officers are due to stand trial in the future. Now, of course, their accessories are calling them accomplice liability, so a lot of their convictions might be contingent on what happens in this particular trial, but the idea that they're kept together, I want to know, are we going to hear the body cam footage about what they said right after George Floyd was taken away? How about after they were notified he died? Remember, the Sergeant Edwards said, when I got on the scene, I told them, turn on your body cams if they aren't already on. So, is there a lapse in time from what they actually knew to then? Well, we'll look at here. And finally, Bianna, you know, we're talking about CPR training. We're talking about all these things. If you right now, if you were told, take your pulse, move your knee, think of the minimal efforts required. You need not be CPR trained. You don't have to be an EMT. You would put your fingers to your neck, on your wrist, move your knee. That's the minimal effort we're talking about here. To get to the life-saving measures that needed to be taken, or as the paramedic said, to give him a second chance of life, they could have precluded it by very minor actions. The question still remains for these jurors. Why didn't Derek Chauvin do that? It's antithetical to training. It just simply belies common sense. He still has explaining to do, and as of yet, the defense has not been able, in any case, to answer that question.
Yeah, as you said, antithetical to training, because as we had seen from those witnesses who had not been police officers, though one of them was an EMT, so trained to attend to somebody who's in distress, their instinct was to help them, right? Now that we've heard from veteran police officers that that is in fact what the protocol is, you have to wonder how damning that is and what impact that's going to have on the jury. Quickly, before we go in this last moment, Laura, I wanted to get your sense, was it weird or not, in your opinion, that the defense didn't cross-examine the first police officer?
I think it was odd in the sense they didn't address that issue of the officer on the scene. But remember, these defense attorneys are not worried about the other 3. They're worried about the one who is actually standing trial now.
That is right. Laura Coates, thank you so much. We really appreciate having you on, and of course,
engine only from red. Minutes extending what Dr. Walensky said about the real world effectiveness of the vaccine. If I could have the first slide. There have been a couple of things that have occurred over the last several days that are worthy of note. The recent MMWR from the CDC showed that the messenger RNA of both Moderna and Pfizer continues to show a 90% effectiveness in real-world conditions of health workers. Also, there was a report from Pfizer about 100% protective in adolescents, as well as vaccine protection in adults up to 6 months. Next slide. This is the MMWR from the CDC, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, showed that for both the Pfizer and the Moderna, there's a durable efficacy of 90%. I want to point out in the yellow highlighted on the bottom of the slide, there were only 3 PCR confirmed infections that occurred in almost 79,000 person days with full immunization, which comes to 0.04 per 1,000 person days. This is extraordinary. When you do clinical trials, often the efficacy in the pristine conditions of a trial turn out to be better than the real-world effectiveness. What we are seeing is effectiveness that's easily as good, if not better, than what we've seen with the efficacy. Next slide. In addition, in this slide here from Pfizer and BioNTech showed high efficacy up to 6 months. But I want to point out one aspect of this that is very interesting. Part of the study was done in South Africa. Although it was relatively small in size, they showed in the setting of the troublesome B1351 South African variant, that there were 6 cases in the placebo and 0 in the vaccinated group, strongly suggesting the efficacy of the vaccines that we're using now against problematic variants. Next slide. With regard to adolescent populations, the goal obviously is to vaccinate the entire population. And children and adolescents make up about 22% of the population. And emerging data suggests that vaccination can prevent asymptomatic carriage. We're doing further studies to nail this down. Next slide. And then finally, what you see here is that in a study of adolescents, where you did a study most recently in which it was shown to be literally 100% efficacy, in which 18 cases of COVID-19 was seen in the placebo group, and again, no cases in the vaccine group. Currently, there are
for approximately a month, and I believe that was hit.
I think when you reach a certain level of, fame,
Yeah.
you don't have to do much in terms of things like that.
Right.
I got to come up with my own Instagram captions, which is, really tough for
Yeah.
me. But yeah, I don't think she wrote it.
Good day, I'm Andrea Mitchell in Washington, continuing our coverage of the Derek Chauvin murder trial in Minneapolis. This week we've seen a mix of testimony, including emotional moments from eyewitnesses, then first responders, and this morning the Minneapolis Police Department's most senior homicide officer, Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman, testifying that officers are routinely trained in use of force and that they are taught not to kneel on suspects' necks.
How often do you get instruction on the use of force?
Once a year.
And how many officers have to go through that use of force training every year?
Every officer on the police department.
That includes the guy who's number 1 in seniority?
It includes me, yes, absolutely.
And when you, well, let me ask it this way. Are there also Minneapolis Police Department policies about the use of force?
Yes, there is.
And are you required to be familiar with those policies?
Yes, you are.
And when you do that use of force training, does it cover the policies as well?
Yes.
Do you also do some physical activity, taking people down and rolling around?
Yes, we have a mat that we use at our SLC center, and it's like a huge wrestling mat.
And are you familiar with the use of force continuum?
Yes.
Is that part of the Minneapolis Police Department use of force policy?
Yes, it is.
Have you ever, in all the years you've been working for the Minneapolis Police Department, been trained to kneel on the neck of someone who is handcuffed behind their back in a prone position?
No, I haven't.
Is that, if that were done, would that be considered force?
Absolutely.
What level of force might that be?
That would be the top tier the deadly force.
Why?
Because of the fact that if your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill them.
And we have two other big breaking news stories that we're covering at this hour. President Biden announcing just within the hour good news, great news for everyone in America. The White House, the economy adding more than 900,000 jobs last month as the president continues to push his new sweeping infrastructure and jobs plan. And just moments ago, the CDC releasing new travel guidance for vaccinated Americans. The CDC now saying you can travel safely once you are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. When traveling within the U.S., you no longer have to get a COVID test before or after traveling if you are 2 weeks past your final vaccine dose. But we begin with the Chauvin murder trial in Minneapolis. Joining us now, NBC's SIOUX booster in Minneapolis, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, civil rights attorney David Henderson, and Washington Post columnist Eugene Robinson. Welcome.
Taking the police away.
Oftentimes, their choices in that buffet is sort of who's the best of the worst. I have to say the candidates, for example, in this last...
Give us some idea of just how this day so far has played out.
Well, I think that testimony really started to pick up right before that recess as they got into the talk and discussion about the use of force and the training there. And we just got some notes from the reporters inside of the room. Remember, 2 reporters allowed in that courtroom. And the reporter notes that the line of questioning with Lieutenant Zimmerman regarding the testimony about handcuffs, the prone position, use of force, it really got several more jurors to start taking notes. We know that in the courtroom, sometimes jurors have become a little bit fidgety, as one of the pool reporters started to say. But when they started getting on the detail of the use of force and that sound that you just heard there, it seems that many of them started picking up their pens and papers and taking notes. That's a pattern that we've been seeing throughout the trial, that these jurors, many of them have been taking notes, sometimes going back, flipping back to different pages and adding to their previous notes. So that's something that we're seeing there. But Andrea, you're really seeing the development of the prosecution and them laying out their case. We started the week with those emotional testimony, witnesses, I should say, in their testimony of pleading with the officers at the scene. We heard yesterday from the paramedics and those graphic images that they showed the jury about as they tried to resuscitate George Floyd. Today, it sounds like we're heavy on the law enforcement side and the talk of use of force.
And as you say, Lieutenant Zimmerman is back on the stand. The brief recess is over. Let's go back to the testimony. We'll pick it up on the other side.
Back to the incident on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
Earlier, you told the jurors about being at the scene, finishing your work there. The next day, did you have an opportunity to review some video of that incident?
Yes.
And do you recall what that video, where you saw it?
Yes.
And since then, have you had an opportunity to watch other video of the incident?
Yes.
And specifically, have you watched body-worn camera video of the incident from the involved officers?
Yes.
And based on that and your years of training and experience with the Minneapolis Police Department, you saw then Officer Chauvin with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, correct?
Yes.
Would you call what you saw there a use of force?
Yes.
And did that use of force continue until the ambulance arrived?
Yes, it did.
Was there any change in the level of force being used until the ambulance arrived?
No.
And what do you think about that use of force during that time period?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about that use of force during that time period?
You're a little vague. Could you limit it to the time frame?
Right. Okay. So, based on your review of the body-worn camera videos of the incident,
yes,
and directing your attention to that moment when Mr. Floyd is placed on the ground,
yes,
what is your view of that use of force during that time period?
Totally unnecessary.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, pulling him down to the ground, face down, and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
So in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?
Absolutely.
And I should add to that question then, also that it appeared he had stopped resisting.
I'm sorry?
And it appeared he had stopped putting up any resistance.
Absolutely, I would stop.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
I may just have a moment, Your Honor. Just for just a second.
If so, how do you square that with these new guidelines today?
Thank you for that question.
Good morning, Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
So you testified that you have been a Minneapolis police officer since June 5th, 1985, correct?
1985, yes.
And prior to that, you were with another agency?
Yes.
And when you initially came on to the Minneapolis Police Department, you were a patrol officer, correct?
Yes.
You were a patrol officer from 1985 to approximately 1993 when you took the sergeant's exam and were promoted.
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that since 1993, so 27, 28 years, you've not been on patrol in the city of Minneapolis.
Correct.
Your assignments have been investigative in nature, correct?
Yes.
And generally speaking, an investigative role is more of a follow-up type role, right?
Yes.
So an incident occurs on the street, it gets assigned to a detective, and then your job is to investigate the circumstances of that incident, right?
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that since 1993, you've not, other than perhaps for ceremonial reasons, you've not worn a uniform on a daily basis.
Well, I don't know if I would call it ceremonial.
Well,
I have to wear a uniform.
You have to wear a uniform from time to time, but your daily role is as a plainclothed police officer, correct?
Yes.
And you're not out patrolling the streets, making arrests, things of that nature?
No.
All right. And it's fair to say then that your experience with the use of force of late has been primarily through training.
Through what?
Your training.
Yes.
All right. Meaning you're not out actively, other than perhaps arresting a homicide suspect, you're not out actively patrolling and arresting people for less serious offenses.
No.
Right. And so you describe the use of force continuum as including mere presence being a type of the use of force, right?
Yes.
And so when you arrive on scene as a lieutenant in the homicide unit, that is a use of force, right?
If people know I'm a lieutenant, yes.
Or if they know you're a police officer, perhaps. Right. And then you described like soft techniques like escort holds, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
And I'm assuming that in the last, well, since 1993 and you were promoted to sergeant, you've handcuffed some people in that time frame.
I have.
Right. When's the last time you got in a physical fight with a person?
About in 2018.
Okay, so it's been a couple of years since you've been in a physical fight with a person?
Yes.
All right. And so you would agree that the use of force as an investigator is, or the higher levels of force as an investigator is less likely than a patrol officer?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
I'll rephrase it. The frequency with which you have to use higher levels of force as an investigator doesn't happen all that often, right?
Correct.
And so your experience generally as a use of force or involving the use of force is primarily in this annual what's called defensive tactics training, right?
Yes.
And the defensive tactics training is one of the requirements you need to use or to complete in order to maintain your license as a police officer, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that, or I'm presuming that since 1985 until the present day, tactics have changed as a police officer.
Some tactics have changed, yes.
Right. And it's fair to say that you are not a trainer in the Minneapolis Police Academy relevant to the use of force, correct?
That's correct, yes.
You do not teach other police officers defensive tactics.
No, I don't.
You would agree, however, that roughly 10 years ago, the Minneapolis Police Department kind of moved away from trying to hit people to control them and started using body weight to try to control people.
I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay, so you think that, I mean, within the arsenal, so to speak, of a police officer, it's as common to punch or strike someone in the use of force as it is to just use what are called takedown moves or body weight pins.
Yes.
Okay. And that's been throughout your entirety of your career?
Yes.
Okay. And so, and you're basing that again on your experience as just going through the defensive tactics requirements?
Right.
All right. And again, as a lieutenant and the #1 senior officer in the Minneapolis Police Department, I'm presuming that your understanding of the use of force involves the Minneapolis Police Department policies on the use of force, right?
Yes.
And the Minneapolis Police Department policies are designed, at least based on your understanding, to address the legal requirements for the use of force.
Yes.
And so there are factors, correct, to determine whether or not a use of force is proportional, reasonable, things of that nature, right?
Correct.
And what we look at in any particular case is the totality of the circumstances. Agreed?
Yes.
Treat PD. Visit takeonpd.com today.
They're woke corporate hypocrites. They make billions of dollars in a country that doesn't even have elections.
Circumstances. Agreed?
Yes.
So there's lots of different information that a police officer has to use in order to determine the level of force to be used under which circumstances.
Yes.
Agreed?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department, are you familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking or critical decision-making model?
Yes.
And you would agree, I'm assuming again, based on a long career, that an officer is constantly taking in new information, and that information will affect the decisions he or she makes, right?
That's correct.
And would you also agree that the training that you received initially as a police officer is probably a lot different than the academy now?
Yes.
Obviously, the available tools that officers have are a lot different today than they were in, 85, 90, 95.
Yes.
Body cameras, they didn't exist when you first became a police officer.
That's correct.
Tasers were not a thing either, right?
No.
You carried a gun and some handcuffs and kind of old school cop, right?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the decision making of a police officer, would you agree that there are certain pieces of information that that officer has that affect his or her decisions on the use of force.
Yes.
And some of that information is very immediate, kind of low-level information. Agreed?
Yes.
So, for example, what just happened with this particular suspect, right?
Yes.
Is this suspect under the influence of a controlled substance, or is he sober?
Yes.
Right? What are you looking at in that moment through your own eyes, right?
Yes.
That's the officer's experience in any situation, right?
Right.
You look at other things that may be hazards or threats in the immediate vicinity, correct?
Yes.
So you're going to assess, are there people watching? Are there people videotaping? Are those people happy or angry, etc., right?
Yes.
You're going to look at what we would refer to as scene security, right?
Yes.
You have a responsibility as a police officer for your partners who may be close to you, right?
Yes.
You have a responsibility as a police officer for all of the people in the immediate area, right?
Yes.
And so scene security is kind of trying to keep it as tight as possible and keep everybody in the area safe. Agreed?
That's correct. Everybody.
In turn, you were asked a series of questions about your an officer's medical responsibilities.
I'm sorry.
You were asked a series of questions about your medical training and an officer's medical, what they're supposed to do.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And even in the assessment of a medical emergency, there are many factors that come into that assessment, correct?
Yes.
To your knowledge, Minneapolis police officers, basically you're taught how to apply tourniquets, patches for gunshots, stop bleeding, basic CPR, and resuscitative efforts, right?
That's correct.
A police officer's job primarily is to keep the scene safe, agreed?
I'm sorry?
A police officer's responsibility is to keep the scene secure and safe, agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis police policy requires the involvement of a higher level of medical intervention if the circumstances dictate, correct?
Yes.
And an officer is required, if someone is having a medical emergency, to take what steps they're able to reasonably in the moment, right?
Yes.
And that would include potentially calling EMS. But then, so you've got all of these immediate factors, right, that come into play. But then you can kind of widen that lens a little bit, and there are some other factors that come into play in terms of the use of force, again, based on your training and experience.
Yes.
Such as, what do we know about the location generally, right?
Yes.
Is this a field in the middle of the woods, or is this a higher crime area, right?
Yes.
An officer is evaluating that as a process, as a part of the process involving the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
You look at other things such as tactical advantages or disadvantages. Agreed?
Yes.
So if you are not able to get what's called concealment or cover, that becomes a question, right?
In what?
Well, in a use of force, you're examining the surrounding area, right? To see if something happens, can I conceal and cover, right?
Yes.
You also, in addition to the scene security, you need to deal with securing the scene, which is different than scene security. Agreed?
Yes.
Scene security is maintaining the safety of everyone around, including yourself and your partners, right?
Yes.
Securing the scene is making sure that the scene itself is preserved and kept tight, right?
Correct, yes.
And in fact, a police officer's responsibility and part of the use of force determination is to prevent or avoid the use of force against other people. Agreed?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you have to use force against one person to avoid using force against others. That's a factor that an officer should consider. Agreed?
I don't know if I would agree with that.
Okay. Again, within the training department, those people who are, it's their jobs to do that. They may be better to answer those questions?
Yes.
All right. And then even from there, you can widen the lens even further, and an officer will look at his training, right?
Yes.
What he is trained to do or not to do, right?
Yes.
He will look and take into experience, or he or she will take into account his or her own experience from their past career. Agreed?
Yes.
So things like fighting with someone, and what's the probability or possibility that that person is going to continue fighting with you in the future, right? Even after you have them subdued.
I don't know, I don't think I can agree to that totally, but
okay.
I understand what you're saying.
There are circumstances where after a person is rendered unconscious, and then you perform, you revive that person, that they are more combative than they were initially. Agreed?
Yes. Yep.
And again, in terms of your own past experience, an officer's own past experiences, they're taking that into consideration as well.
Sure.
The Minneapolis police officer to use a knee on the neck of a suspect.
That's correct.
You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?
Yes.
And that can even involve improvisation, agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis Police Department policy allows a police officer to use whatever means are available to him to protect himself and others, right?
Yes.
So if there's a paint can sitting on the table and someone is attacking, you can use that paint can as a weapon.
Yes.
And in fact, you have been trained in the prone handcuffing techniques, correct?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that Minneapolis Police Department has never ever trained anyone to put their knee across the shoulder and to the base of the neck?
I didn't say that.
Okay. So you would agree then that pursuant to Minneapolis Police Department training, when a suspect is arrested and in the process of being handcuffed or being restrained, it would be consistent with the Minneapolis Police Department training you've received to place your knee across the shoulder to the base of the neck.
I don't know if I've, part of your question was handcuffing, and we've certainly been trained to put the knee on the shoulder, but I don't know about just restraining a person. I don't recall being trained in that, but.
Okay. Again, possible based on the circumstances.
Sure.
Right? And when an officer is restraining a person and has called for EMS, have you heard the term that we're holding this person for EMS?
Yes.
Okay. And essentially that means you want to keep them in that position until EMS arrives because they're more capable to deal with whatever this situation is. Agreed?
No, I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay. How would you describe the term hold for EMS?
Hold for EMS is that you are holding him for EMS or her.
And sometimes people are held for EMS in a restrained position. Agreed?
Yes, sometimes. Yeah.
Now you also testified that once a person is handcuffed, the threat, I think you said, is gone. It's at the lowest threat level, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now that obviously, a person who's handcuffed can still pose a threat, right?
I suppose they could, yeah.
So an officer who is even though he has someone handcuffed, that person could continue to kick the officer.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
That person could continue to thrash his body around, agreed?
Sure.
And part of the reason police officers restrain people is for that person's own safety, agreed?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, it also presumes that the handcuffs were placed on correctly, right?
Yes.
Sometimes in a struggle or an attempt to handcuff someone, handcuffs aren't placed on properly and they can pop open or be too big for a suspect, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen them too big, you know, for a suspect. Sometimes they're too tight.
Okay.
But
if sometimes in the process of handcuffing someone, one handcuff goes on, thereby giving the suspect a potential weapon if he were to break free, right?
Yes.
Or she, for that
yes.
matter. And officers have been attacked with their own handcuffs, in your experience, right?
Oh yeah, yes.
So you would agree that the use of force is a dynamic series of decision making based on a lot of different information.
Absolutely.
To be holding a press conference in lieu of that to take
is a dynamic series of decision making based on a lot of different information.
Absolutely.
And it's based upon a lot of information that is not necessarily captured on a body camera. Agreed?
Yes, that's correct.
The body camera is only so effective to show what the body camera sees and not what the officer sees.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of what you did in this particular case, essentially, you would be what's called, are you what's called Car 21? Is that the homicide unit? And I may
no, it's not.
Car 9? I don't know.
No.
You're just homicide. There's some car associated with homicide, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What car is that?
We would be car, well, it would be like car 112 or 108 or 110.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
All right. So you got called, or you were made aware of this incident back on May 25th of 2020. You understood it to be a critical incident, correct?
Yes.
And it is Minneapolis Police Department policy to turn over the investigation of any critical incident, or the majority of critical incidents, we should say, to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, right?
Yes.
And that is to avoid any potential conflicts between the involved officers, right?
Yes.
And so your role, you heard this call came out and you kind of self-assigned to show up here?
Yes.
And you did that because you wanted to make sure the scene was secure, right?
Yes.
To make sure that the officers who had responded to the scene were doing the things that they should be doing in connection with a critical incident.
That's correct.
Such as roping off or tying off the tape, or taping off the scene, I should say, right?
Putting up crime scene tape?
Yes.
Yes.
Not permitting citizens to come wandering through the scene, right?
Yep. Yep.
Canvassing the area, I think you said. And ultimately, your role in this particular case was limited to a couple of hours of time, making sure those things were done, and until BCA agents arrive and you handed off the scene, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And it was not until later that you were asked to review the body-worn cameras of the officers and consider the use of force, right?
Yes.
And it would not be within your normal role or job duties to do such a use of force analysis, right?
That's correct.
I have no further questions.
Redirect.
Lieutenant Zimmerman, you had the opportunity to review the body-worn cameras from
Yes.
officers involved.
Yes.
Did that also capture the bystanders on the sidewalk during the incident?
Yes.
Was there something about that group of bystanders that in your assessment was an uncontrollable threat to the officers at the scene?
No.
Would there be a way, or well, I mean, I ask it this way. Would there be other ways for officers to deal with bystanders?
Yes.
And could that include calling for backup?
Yes.
Would the presence of multiple officers at a scene be a relevant fact for an officer to consider when using an amount of force on a handcuffed and restrained subject?
No, it should be.
Well, but if there's some concern about the crowd, would it be relevant that there were other officers already at the scene?
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, it doesn't matter, the crowd, as long as they're not attacking you. The crowd really doesn't, shouldn't have an effect on your actions.
You were asked if the use of force training has changed over time.
Yes.
But you still get the most up-to-date training every year when you go to the use of force training.
I do, yes.
And you were asked about, has the academy changed since you went to the academy?
Yes.
And you haven't been through the academy since then, correct?
Right, yeah.
But you have some familiarity with how the academy trains new officers?
Absolutely.
And do you think that academy training provides appropriate training for officers?
Yes, it should.
And would provide the most up-to-date training on the use of force for Minneapolis officers that take the academy type training? You were asked if you were a trainer, and you are not a use of force trainer.
That's correct.
You are a student of use of force. And, but it's your testimony that based on all the training you go through every year, it's well known that the prone position is dangerous.
Absolutely, yes.
Doesn't take a trainer to be able to say that, you've learned it.
Yes.
And that's been something that's been trained. You were asked about the critical decision-making model.
Yes.
Familiar with that from your training?
Yes.
And part of that is continually reassessing the need for force.
Correct.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And so that would include reassessing the location,
Yes.
the tactical advantage,
Yes.
conceal and cover,
Yes.
scene security,
Yes.
security in scene,
Yes.
or security of the scene,
Yes.
medical distress of the person restrained,
Yes.
When you watched the body camera videos, did those videos capture those types of circumstances relative to the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
And you were able to assess those things in telling the jury what you thought earlier about the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
I am.
When you watched those videos, at some point during the restraint, did you see Mr. Floyd kicking the officers?
No, I didn't.
may have happened initially, but after that, did you see any kicking?
No, none.
Defense counsel asked you about the concept of holding for EMS.
Yes.
So sometimes it's necessary to keep the person there so they can receive medical treatment.
That's correct.
Does holding for EMS excuse an officer from providing medical attention that they've been trained to provide?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from continuing to use this decision-making model about the use of force?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from using other resources like other officers at the scene to
No.
deal? You were asked about handcuffs. If handcuffs are not properly locked, can they tighten?
Yes.
Can they loosen?
I'm sorry?
If they're properly connected, can they loosen?
Mm-hmm.
They can come open. But if they're locked, can they still tighten?
That's right.
If they're not, I think the term is double locked.
Right, yes.
And based on your review of the body cams, did you see any need for Officer Chauvin to improvise by putting his knee on Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No, I did not.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Any requests? All right. Thank you, Lieutenant. You may step down. Thank you. Counsel Cyber?
Dope to thallium poisoning.
That I was on. Got it. Okay.
She's all alone with the ghost. Don't worry, Samantha. I'll save Shelley.
You need to hire. I need indeed.
Impugn the experience, really, of this most senior officer. David?
I think it's a mixed bag with this witness. It does help to hear, yes, Derek Chauvin went too far, which we all know. At the same time, each one of these police witnesses is a double-edged sword because I think the defense can actually score a lot of points with them. I thought that's what they're going to be moving towards because essentially what they're saying is, look, the book says you're not supposed to do it, but that's not necessarily...
Members of the jury, that's going to do it for today. So we're going to release you.
And
And Eugene Robinson, let's talk about the bigger picture, the wider picture. The fact that what we have now heard from police witnesses, experienced police witnesses who had signed a letter in June discrediting and disagreeing with what Officer Chauvin did. We know that police, especially uniformed police, have a great deal of credibility with jurors. Do you think that the prosecution is doing a good job of trying to pre-butt what we expect to hear from the defense?
I think they're doing a very good job. First of all, you notice when the police officers testify, they look at the jury. They're used to testifying in court, and they know how to speak to juries and to how to communicate to juries and how to come across. So that's one reason why police officers are often very effective witnesses. And I thought Lieutenant Zimmerman's testimony was just devastating for the defense. I mean, I really did. He blew a hole in the defense strategy, basically, or there are two big elements of it. Number one, that in his opening, Chauvin's defense counsel said, he did what he was trained to do. Well, Lieutenant Zimmerman just told the court and the world that, no, this is not what he was trained to do. He was not trained to put a handcuffed person in a prone position and keep them there for an extended period of time. And he was certainly not trained to put his knee on the neck of a suspect in that condition, especially after the person had been subdued. And then he blew a giant hole in the sort of paranoid and I think, frankly, racist, angry mob scenario that the defense is trying to paint, that the officers were so worried about somehow being threatened by the group of onlookers who were concerned about what was happening to George Floyd. And I call them a group because it wasn't that big. It wasn't big enough to call it a crowd. And while clearly the people were angry, as Lieutenant Zimmerman said, that should not have an impact because they were not being attacked. The crowd was being compliant. In fact, they would get back on the sidewalk whenever the other officer told them to do it. So I think this coming from the most senior officer in the Minneapolis Police Department. I've covered a lot of trials. I know you can't read juries. Sometimes it comes across in ways that you don't quite expect. But it's hard for me not to think that this was pretty devastating to the defense today, and that was very powerful testimony.
Used to be. I mean, if anything, the needle has moved in a positive direction, not a negative direction. And the actions of Chauvin are just unjustifiable, even when the defense is raising all these, hypotheticals. What if this, what if that? It has nothing to do with what actually took place on May 25th of last year. Absolutely nothing. This case has to stand on its own. And his use of force in that situation has to stand on its own based on the facts and circumstances of that case. Not the what if, woulda, coulda, shoulda, what took place that day, and why did he use the level of force that he used for that sustained period of time. Is that consistent with policy and training? The answer to that is no.
And so, Laura Coates, we are now at the end of the first week of testimony. 5 days of trial testimony, 17 days if you go back to some of the pretrial hearings and the selection of the jury and all that, but 5 days now for these jurors who go home for the weekend. I want to walk through some of what played out during the week, but I want to start with this, especially as we watched Lieutenant Zimmerman finish his testimony, then the cross-examination, and then the redirect from the prosecutor. One of the challenges for a prosecutor, you can plan everything the night before, you can work with your witness the night before, but then you have to react. You have to be nimble and react to what you saw. And you mentioned the defense attorney, Eric Nelson, he's doing the best he can there with the material he has, trying to say to your point, well, you've been on the desk for a long time. You're not in a patrol car. You're not a guy jumping out of a patrol car in these tense situations. It's been a long time since you've been on the street, in the rough and tumble, if you will. And so then the prosecutor has to get back up, as Mr. Frank did, then walking through, well, let's go through this again. Just your sense, your grading of the prosecution and their nimbleness in reacting.
I think they were great at being nimble at this because, of course, they're not only up against trying to have the explanation to laymen about what is actually a common sense issue. They don't have to prove things that the average person would not be able to understand. The average person has a neck and a knee and understands the constriction of breathing. The average person would be able to understand what you would not advise your own child to do in rough play or otherwise. And so he's really trying to point out methodically, and I understand the constraints of the defense. And again, John, we have yet to see the defense case or the battle of the experts on that substantial causal factor of death and the autopsy medical examiner. But so far, the prosecutors are buttressed in their ability to understand common sense and what jurors are thinking here. You've got this idea, what I thought was very striking was that every single law enforcement officer that we've seen so far, normally you hear about this sort of blue code of silence and trying to protect one of their own. You saw a distancing of a 10-foot pole away from Derek Chauvin, not trying to filter their testimony through the filter of, hey, look, he's one of us, I can understand what he did. No, they were quite forthright and resolute about this officer being rogue in a sense. So I think that's very powerful. And going into a weekend, time is going to be the best friend of the prosecution because all these questions that have not been answered as to what would it have taken to have taken his pulse, to take your knee off him, what would it have taken to do those things, that's lingering in the juror's mind for Friday, for Saturday, for Sunday, into Monday. We have no indication that the defense case is going to happen next week. This is going to stew and fester and not to the benefit of Derek Chauvin.
And Chief, to that point,
I have to say is that we have
enforcement. You're also watching as a human being as this plays out. To Laura's point, the prosecution hopes that it won the first week. It knows this is a long journey. It knows the defense, the prosecution controls the pace and the witness list right now. The defense will get that choice. But just from watching throughout the week, yourself, if you were a juror, are you going home with questions? The prosecution left me wondering this, or are you going home thinking, so far, these guys have made a compelling case?
Well, the prosecution has made a compelling case, and the defense is fortunate that it's not wrapping up today, that there's still more to come, because quite frankly, they don't really have a leg to stand on right now, in my opinion. I do think it's going to come down to the more expert witnesses, especially the autopsy report, medical examiner. What was the cause of death? Was the actions of Chauvin the substantial contributing factor to his cause of death? Once you go through the whole thing about his enlarged heart and drugs and so forth. And that's going to be critical. And who wins that battle? And that's going to decide this case, in my opinion, because I think clearly, as far as what we've seen so far and what we've heard so far, this isn't something that they're going to be able to say at the end of the day that was consistent with his training and with policy of the Minneapolis Police Department. They've lost that one. They can only hope now that when the expert witnesses come forward, they will find somebody to testify more in their favor. In terms of that medical examiner's report. I think everything's going to wind up hinging on that.
Chief Ramsey, Laura Coates, grateful for your time and insights throughout this first.
What I will say that I think maybe, Mr. Waxman, the one limit.
July, August, September, we started to get back. It started to look good, and people started to come back out.
Heart condition or high blood pressure. Zoonosis can cause
can really make a difference, and the recommendations from the CDC about opening up travel to fully vaccinated individuals is one example of the difference vaccine can make. But
your view of
vaccinated, and we need to address the fact that we still have many populations in this country and around the world that haven't had access to vaccine yet.